Hi, welcome back, guys. This is your friend Collar. What if with another fiction? What if Deku, the hero of two worlds? Now, before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now, let's get into the fanfic. Izuku closed his textbook as he reclined in his chair, his head hanging over the backrest as he let out a sigh. He had read the book back and forth almost 10 times throughout his life, and even though nothing had changed, he felt drawn to the book every now and then, needing to just confirm that he wasn't crazy. Such a waste of time. Get up. Go run. Exercise. You must be big and strong if you wish to get a good wife. Izuku winced at the voice, turning and glaring at the semi-transparent samurai who was kneeling on his bed, hovering a few centimeters off of the covers. He glared at him for a moment, before sighing and standing up. Sure, Minamoto, let's go for a run. But can you stop talking about me getting a wife? I'm 16. Bah. I had 3 girls as potential wives when I was your age. Izuku shook his head as the ghost floated alongside him. He put on his tracksuit and grabbed a long case out from under his bed, putting the strap over his shoulder and adjusting it so the case sat snug on his back. He opened his door and stuck his arm out, the flood of transparent figures floating around the hallway, either pausing or moving out of his way as he squeezed out of his doorway and made his way to the kitchen. Hey, sweetie, how was school? Oh, is Mr. Minamoto taking you for some more practice? Izuku smiled at his mum, nodding his head as he sidestepped the ghost of a sumo wrestler who had fallen asleep in front of the couch. The couch that his shoes were under. Yay, I am, but I need my sneakers. Could you grab them for me with your quirk? I can't get down there. Inko chuckled as she saw him sitting a meter away from the couch, seemingly leaning on the air, his arm moving up and down as if the air he was leaning on was breathing. That usually meant that, is Kano in your way again? Izuku sighed, his palm opening up and squishing his cheek a little. Yay, he's asleep. It's already pretty weird that ghosts can sleep, and sometimes it's just annoying. Inko dragged his shoes out from under the couch with her quirk, and Izuku motioned her to keep going until eventually giving her a thumbs up and picking them up, sitting on the coffee table as he slipped them on. Inko hummed as she looked at the long case on his back. Did you remember to pack your gauntlets into the case again this time? You know what happens when you don't. Mr. Minamoto is never happy. As she spoke, she saw Izuku's head dart forward, and his hand come up to the back of it as he glared at something beside him. I did, thank you very much. I've had enough of Mr. Minamoto's idea of punishment for one lifetime. Inko smiled as Izuku finished tying up his shoelaces and jumped to his feet, and then ducked under something, seemingly having to weave his way in and around 100 invisible objects to cross a room that was completely empty for her. He ran out of the front door with a grin on his face, and Inko sighed. That was just the weirdness that she guessed happened when your son was able to see and touch the spirits of the afterlife. Wrong. Do it again, like this. 5 laps. Izuku rubbed at his wrists, the impact from the ghostly softwood sword that Mr. Minamoto had in his hands still stinging as the samurai performed the proper form. Izuku focused on the way the man's ghosts' hips turned as he stuck, and ran off around the clearing he was training in, doing the 5 laps the man had given him. When he finished them, he got back into his kendo stance, wooden sword held out in front of him, and replicated the proper form as best he could. That was better. My word. If we had students that listened when I was alive, haha. We might have even been able to. Izuku looked over, noticing that the ghost seemed to pause at that, and he could even kind of sense the feeling of melancholy surrounding Mr. Minamoto right then. He smiled sadly, knowing that it was never easy for a ghost to remember the people, places, events, the lives that they could never get back to. So, as he adjusted his foot so that it was just slightly off the angle he was meant to be putting it at, he pulled the oldest card in the Dealing with Ghosts playbook. He distracted the man. Sir, I think my footing is a bit off. Ah, You would correct. It is 5 laps. Izuku sighed as he rounded a corner and silently ducked into a bush. Why? Why in God's name was Eraserhead in the area? This wasn't his patrol route. He should be on the other side of the city. He sat silently, not even his breathing making a noise, as the hero landed on the sidewalk in front of the garden Izuku was hiding in, rolling to a stop and jumping to his feet. What the? Izuku had been training with a great many ghosts over the years, learning many skills, tricks, and techniques that most people weren't aware of. And after he had turned 16, he hadn't been able to hold himself back any longer. With a sword in hand and a black outfit put together, Izuku had started a habit of vigilantism. Sort of. It was hard to call him a vigilante when he was a quirkless teenager fighting ghosts, spirits, and other supernatural beings, none of which had any legal documents saying it was illegal. Still, he was sure that when Eraserhead has turned the corner of an alleyway and seen a figure in dark clothes cutting a brightly colored, humanoid figure in half with a sword, he might get a little suspicious about said dark figure being a villain. Maybe just a little. Eraserhead searched the area for a while, even shining a flashlight into the garden Izuku was sitting in at one point. But Izuku was crouched low enough, and was still enough that the hero seemed to have missed him. The man let out a grunt, said fuck under his breath, and flung his scarf out, swinging away like that old American comic book hero. Izuku let his breath return to normal and peeked his head out of the bush after he was sure that the man was actually gone. This could potentially complicate his time at UA. When he got in, of course. Hello, sir. I saw on the notice board that you were looking for an exorcist. The old man stared down at Izuku from the doorway, and Izuku could tell he had some sort of bug-type heteromorphic quirk because he was about 10 feet tall and with incredibly long, thin limbs. The mandibles next to his mouth just kinda proved his idea more. Yay, I am. But you're just a kid. Izuku frowned, but not at the man's words, as he had heard much worse over the years. He was frowning at the way that the man seemed to be surrounded by an angry feeling aura, and could tell that the man was being affected by some type of spirit. Coughing into his hand, Izuku continued. I am young, yes, but I am a capable exorcist, and I don't charge much, so you're not really taking a huge risk. The man looked him up and down again, and he paused when he apparently finally realized that Izuku had a pack slung across his torso and a sword at his opposite hip. Why the fuck do you have a sword? Izuku just smiled, patting the top of the hilt as he intentionally moved his gaze to the ghosts around the man, who seemed to realize that he could see them very quickly. I have to be able to fight back against the really angry spirits, somehow, you know. Rah, Eric. Izuku took deep breaths as he knelt outside of the circle he had drawn on the ground as the ghost he had trapped raged inside it. It banged against the air, and the barrier circle shimmered with energy as it kept the ghost from affecting the outside area with its power. He opened his pack and pulled out a book, flipping through the pages until he found the entries on the various types of ghosts. It was his own writing, based on a lot of folklore and theories that he had proved true or false in his experience. This specific type of ghost was a raging phantom, a very dangerous ghost that was able to spark someone's violent impulses if the person had a weak enough will. They sucked. Izuku looked over to the unconscious body on the other side of the roof and winced. The raging phantom had zapped the bug man, whose name he now knew was Mushy, and caused the man to attack him. Izuku had, of course, knocked him out swiftly, not needing a distraction from the raging phantom. But it did mean that he was likely that he wasn't going to be paid well for this job, if at all. He looked at the raging phantom again and sighed, reaching into his pack and pulling out the materials needed to banish it carefully, placing them in their spots. A few minutes and a chant later, the room fell silent as the raging phantom was sent back to whatever realm it came from. Izuku made sure to put Mushi on his bed before sitting and waiting for the man to wake back up. Izuku had a group of people staring at him around for a change as he walked up to the testing grounds at Ua High. But he didn't care. He wouldn't let any of them distract him from his goal. Ever since he was a kid, ever since he realized that the ghosts weren't going away, that he could touch them, he knew what he wanted to do. He would use his skills, his strength, and his sword to protect people from the things they didn't even know were hurting them. He would be a hero. But not just a hero. One that would protect humans from the spirits, ghosts, and whatever other creatures the world of the supernatural threw at them. Mr. Minamoto patted his shoulder encouragingly just before Present Mike let off his yell signaling the start of the test, and Izuku darted into the arena, darting around the various ghosts watching the Ua hopeful sprint. He just hoped that Eraserhead didn't recognize him from his techniques and try to arrest him. "I think that's him, sir. Izuku Midoriya." Nezu hummed as Shota sat down next to him, pointing at one of the screens. Nezu made a grabbing motion, and a copy of the holographic screen zoomed over to him, putting itself into his personal screen. He watched the boy move with the grace of a ballerina, swinging his sword with the skill of a samurai, and smiled. When Shota had told him about the villain in the alleyway using their quirk to make their sword vaporize a guy with a glowing quirk, Nezu had to admit he felt some skepticism. Shota's description felt like such a specific set of circumstances to try and explain, something that Nezu had a much simpler answer to. After all, as an animal, his eyes were privy to many things humans weren't. As Nezu watched Izuku Midoriya dodge and weave between both robots and ghosts, he nodded to himself. "As long as he passes, I think I'll take this one, Shota." Shota's eyebrows furrowed as he glanced at the screen, and then back to Nezu. "You're going to personally teach a villain." Nezu laughed softly, as did the ghosts of the previous principals who hovered around him. No, I believe you are wrong about a few details of that night, Shota. But trust me, Izuku Midoriya is no villain." He smirked as Midoriya's sword cut through a two-pointer and his score passed the basic entry threshold for the school. Nezu saw him give a high five to the ghost of a samurai that was floating just behind his shoulder and chuckled. "I just believe that he may need some teaching that only I can give him." Izuku could remember the first ghost he ever truly met. Their name was Sagasu. Or at least that was the name they gave Izuku after realizing that this 6-year-old kid could actually see and hear them. Izuku would later learn in class that Sagasu just meant searching. Izuku had followed the ghost around pretty much all afternoon, helping Sagasu look for something very important to them. When they hadn't been able to find it that day, Izuku had invited Sagasu to the same spot he'd met him the next day so they could try again. Izuku had met Sagasu there over the next year and a half, almost constantly thinking of places they could search next while he was in class, skipping going out with his friends to the park after school, almost missing out on rare All Might merch. And he hadn't regretted a single moment. Helping Sagasu search in and around the Mustafu area had soothed something in Izuku's soul, a desire to help people that went deeper than just a want. And not only that, but Sagasu was able to help Izuku as well. After all, who better to get advice from on dealing with ghosts than a ghost themselves? "There is a three-pointer behind you, about 20 meters away." Izuku nodded, not looking at Minamoto, but instead giving his focus to the three-pointer he'd just called out. Dropping low, Izuku darted forward, his sword trailing behind him as he dodged past a small congregation of ghosts that were hovering around a blond boy who looked about ready to throw up. After he'd cleared the ghosts, he dodged the slow projectile that the three-pointer had fired with ease, having seen it coming, and darted through the robot's legs, stabbing up into its motor with his sword. The robot shuddered to a stop, which gave Izuku the time to launch himself off the ground from his slide, spinning rapidly as he cut the three-pointer's head clean off. An interesting improvisation on the proper form, but an appropriate one for an opponent so bulky and slow. "Good work. Now duck." Izuku didn't even hesitate to follow Minamoto's guidance, almost forcing himself to faceplant to the ground, his hands beneath him like a sudden push-up. He was lucky he had done it so quickly, too, as a beam of blue and white light shot out from the blonde boy, decimating a one-pointer that had snuck up on him. "Thanks." The blonde boy laughed, tousling his hair. "No need to thank moi. It is a pleasure to do anything that both helps a fellow applicant and gets me some points." Izuku just shook his head at that, before he grunted as Minamoto's ghostly gauntleted hand smacked the back of his head. "Why are you standing around? Get moving, now." "Yes, sir." "Why is this even a discussion, sir? I am certain that boy is at the very least connected to the one I saw killing someone with their quirk. Their movements are too similar to be a coincidence." Nezu sighed as Shouta continued to argue with him, keeping his eyes on Izuku Midoriya's screen. Kept watching him as he sometimes seemingly stepped on the air itself, or moved as if yanked out of the way. There was no doubt in Nezu's mind that Izuku Midoriya could somehow see, touch, and potentially communicate with the dead. And that was just wonderfully intriguing. "You are right about one thing, Shouta. This isn't a discussion. I am asking you to trust me on this. But even if you don't, I am your employer, and do not need your permission to do anything." Nezu's ears perked as he heard Kayama whistle. "Damn, Shouta. I'd drop it if I were you, or Kan might be getting the chill class again this year, tilde." Nezu just smirked softly, enough that it didn't even show through his fur, as Shouta turned back to him, a wary look in his eye. "Fine. But I want you to practically have a leash on this kid, until you can prove to me that I didn't watch him murder someone." Nezu glanced around the room, taking a quick mental survey of the reactions to Shouta's words. Kayama, Recovery Girl, and Ectoplasm seemed neutral to them. All Might seemed mighty concerned by them, and the others seemed to just want to focus on the testing. Even if every instinct in his body was telling him that Hound Dog wasn't happy with any of this. "You're giving me quite the challenge, and you don't even know it, Shouta. But yes, I will be keeping the closest of eyes on that student, if he passes, of course. And while he might be on track to pass right now, there are already surprise hurdles and heroics." He looked over to Majima, who grinned out from under his helmet, sending Nezu a thumbs up. Nezu just nodded, looking forward to seeing what happened next. Send in the 0-pointer. The only difficulty with helping a ghost search for something is that they have a poor sense of time, nor the ability to truly realize the differences in society by themselves. So you can never really know how long it's been them since they died. Izuku learned this the hard way when he was 8 years old, and Sagasu finally realized that what they were searching for was long gone. They'd been looking for someone, and when Izuku asked them about who they were looking for, they were able to figure out that Sagasu had died almost 600 years ago, in the Edo period, and that the person they were looking for had left them behind. On that day, Izuku discovered how dangerous and angry Broken Spirit could be. "Yo, dude, tell your kid or whatever that some big fucking robot is coming from underground." Izuku glanced at the ghost who had run into the alleyway he was fighting in and yelled at Minamoto as the 2-pointer in front of him fell apart, cut into several pieces. "I can hear you myself. How big are we talking?" "Wait, you can fuck it. It doesn't matter. I'm talking bigger than these buildings. Y'all gotta get the fuck out of Dodge." Before Izuku could even respond, Minamoto's hand fell onto his shoulder. "We will be staying until the test ends. But you should leave. My student cannot afford to be distracted right now." Izuku almost laughed as the ghost's face morphed from shock into confusion, then an almost aggressive apathy. "Fine. Don't say I didn't fucking warn you when your student comes and joins us." The ghost was then on its way, leaving Izuku and Minamoto standing in the middle of an alleyway by themselves. Minamoto's hand left his shoulder. "Come, I can feel the other spirits growing restless in this direction." Izuku just nodded, jogging along after the floating samurai ghost, his sword tucked back into its sheath. He had a feeling that if there was a building-sized robot coming into the arena, then it was unlikely that there were many point-based robots left at all. He thought he had enough to pass, a respectable 38 by his count, but he could never be sure. From what he had heard from the ghosts of its past students, Yua had a history of throwing curvy balls at every opportunity. It was just as they had left that the ground under Izuku's feet started to rumble. Robots. She could have screamed her thanks into the sky when she heard that the exam was destroying a bunch of robots. Fighting against people. She hadn't done much of that, which had made the possibility a little worrying, especially with who knows what kind of people and quirks would be here taking the exams. Fighting against robots, where she could just drop them from a height. Now that was no worries at all. Ochako's padded fingers slid over the metal exteriors of the robots next to her as she ran through the open street, lifting up and dropping the robots, crushing them under their own weight. When they were dropped like this, they seemed to break pretty easily as well, meaning that not even the 3-pointer's projectiles could stop her. She was on about 29 points, which was technically more than enough to pass. The only reason she hadn't gotten higher was that she had gone out of her way to move and position the robots she was dropping as shields for some of the other examinees when it looked like they weren't paying attention. She hoped she hadn't messed up her own chances just because she wanted to help. Rumble. She was pulled out of her thoughts as the entire world around her seemed to shake. Nearby buildings started to move back to make space as the intersection in the road in front of her opened. Ochako stumbled back out of instinct, even when the opening gap stopped short almost 10 meters away from her. But it wasn't just because of the ground opening up. It was because of what was exiting the gap. Izuku slid under the swiping arm of a 1-pointer, not even bothering to turn and swing at it with his sword. As he was about to step forward, Minamoto dashed in front of him and held his shoulders, stopping him in his tracks as an errant projectile from a nearby 3-pointer flew through the ghostly samurai's body. Nodding his thanks to Minamoto, Izuku pressed forward. As he did, he could see the mood of the crowd of examinees shift from focusing on combat to escaping whatever was causing the street and buildings around them to shake uncontrollably. The closer he got to the source, the more he ran against the crowd of examinees, instead of just through them. Turning to Minamoto, as the ghost floated alongside him, Izuku frowned. So we're sure that even just attempting to face off against this thing can help get rescue points. That's what Miss Kashiwagi said, right? Miss Kashiwagi was the ghost of a hero who had gone to Yua, whom Izuku had gone to with a request for information from a couple of months ago. She had basically given him a cheat sheet for the non-recommendation entrance exam, including spoiling the inclusion of the 0-pointer for him. But he didn't mind at all, as it gave him time to prepare, and in return, he had offered her a favor that she seemed very excited to have in her pocket. A part of him felt a bit bad about cheating on the exam, but the rest of him knew that he had to get into Yua. It wasn't something that he could leave to chance, not if he ever wanted to have a proper supply of gear and support while fighting against the supernatural. He was pulled from his thoughts as he was forced to dodge out of the way of an examinee who was using their quirk to sprint towards the exit, locking eyes for just a moment with the blue-haired boy, before he vaulted over a car that was in front of his new path. And Nag? His ears pricked as he heard the shout, instantly shifting himself to run towards it. It took him closer and closer to the rumbling, but that was what he was looking for. He reached the corner of a street and had to pause as a deluge of spirits floated quickly around it, murmuring to themselves. Once they'd passed, he turned the corner, intending to start searching for the person who'd shouted straight away. That was the plan, at least, before he was almost frozen by the shock of seeing the 0-pointer. His feet stuck to the ground as he stared up at the building-sized robot. He'd been so focused on running through the crowd and dodging people and ghosts alike that he'd never looked up over the buildings. My word, that's a rather large automaton. Minamoto's odd tone knocked him out of his stupor, however, and he shook his head. Now wasn't the time for cowardice, to be frozen in fear. Now was the time to act and to achieve the first step in securing his future. Ag! Ochako shouted as a jarring sensation ran down her left forearm, right after she'd slapped a bit of debris that had been about to slam into her. She must have underestimated its weight and how fast it was going, because now it felt like she'd fractured something. Rumble. She huffed, clutching her wrist as she heard the giant robot start moving again. She quickly ducked out of the way of a smaller bit of rubble, but the pain in her wrist was distracting. Surely the UA staff would stop the robot if it looked like she was going to get seriously hurt, right? Crack. She tensed up instinctively as she heard something break above her, a shadow appearing on the ground below her. But as she tried to dodge, her ankle buckled. Oh God, when did I hurt that as well? Whoosh. Minamoto, gimme a boost. Her eyes snapped up to see a boy her age unsheath a sword a few meters in front of her, jumping up and then stepping on the air for extra height. As he pushed off with his foot, she almost swore she saw the air shimmering, but it was all too quick to be sure. The sound of the screech of metal on metal filled her ears for a moment, as scraps of what looked like a light pole fell around her, but nothing hit. Soft footsteps landed behind her, almost completely smothered by the sound of the giant robot continuing on its way, and she spun to face the boy, who was sheathing his sword again. Oh, thank you. The boy smiled at her, waving his hand. No worries at all. Are you okay? I can help you get out of here if you're injured. Ochako was about to insist that she was fine when another twinge of pain shot down her arm. She flinched, and the boy's face scrunched up as he clearly noticed. Looking up at the sky to check for more debris, the boy unclasped his sword sheath from his back and held it out to her. Here, if you can hold this for me, I can carry you out of here. Ochako just sighed, testing her ankle one more time, before lifting it again as it stung with pain. Ah, damn it. I'll take you up on that, thanks. I'm not even sure when I hurt my ankle. The boy chuckled softly at that, sweeping under her and lifting her up onto his back, running away from the giant robot. She kept an eye out for any more debris headed their way, but the robot had paused in its path, and the only stuff left falling were small scraps that were easily avoided by the boy. She stayed silent as they exited the exam area, and the boy put her down against the wall. He looked like he was about to say something before his head snapped to the side, looking into the thin air, and he nodded to the empty space. He grabbed his sword from where she'd leaned it up against the wall when he put her down, then put his hands together and did a small bow in her direction. I apologize that I cannot stay to wait with you, but I have to go. He then sprinted off, disappearing into the crowd, his sword strapped to his back again. Ochako sighed. Having to be rescued by some random boy wasn't the way she'd planned to end the exam. She just hoped that she'd done enough to make it in, and that the sword guy did as well, so she could thank him. Remember, you must honor your word and your promise, but do not allow yourself to go too far. It is one thing to repay a debt, and another to be used as a tool. And no student of mine is a tool for anyone but themselves. Izuku nodded to Minamoto, who was hanging back, floating on the outside edge of the old, abandoned property they were standing in front of. Minamoto returned the nod sharply, crossing his legs in midair and closing his eyes. Izuku took a deep breath and walked forward onto the property, immediately feeling the shift in the atmosphere as he crossed the threshold of the fenced area. It would be clear to all spirits, and anybody who can sense the supernatural, that this space had been claimed. Luckily, the domains of human ghosts, even the more malevolent ones, weren't as overbearing as the lairs of true evil spirits. But for an ex-pro hero, this one was rather heavy. Ah, Midoriya, you are back, good. Izuku entered the run-down house in the center of the fenced area and smiled politely as he sat down on the floor. crossing his legs and placing his sword across his knees. "It's a pleasure to see you as well, Miss Kashiwagi. I must thank you for your information about the UA exam. It was spot on." "Ha. I'm glad to hear it. It has been quite a while since I took my own test. So I'm glad that old rat is still sticking to his guns." The ghostly, middle-aged woman floating in front of him was a pretty ghastly sight. Headless and missing her right arm, she was a rarity among human spirits. Ghosts, for the most part, were whole, almost idealistic versions of themselves, the way their soul perceived their body. Traumatic and horrific causes of death could create defects in this system. They still looked nothing like the more evil variety of spirits, whose monstrous forms were not easily forgotten. But luckily, Izuku had been seeing these ghosts pretty much since he was old enough to realize he was alive. So he'd had plenty of time to get used to them. Yay, it seems he has. "Now, for your help. I promised you that I would fulfill one of your requests, correct? Your information was solid. So I have come to honor my end of the deal." The headless ghost of the one-armed woman perked up as he shuffled around a bit, placing his sword in front of him and bowing, his forehead touching the floor. "My sword and my skills are yours in return for your assistance, dear spirit." From the way her aura shifted, he was sure that if Miss Kashiwagi still had a head, she would be grinning at him. "Go to this address, and bring the bastard who killed me to my domain, so that I may have my vengeance." The rain crashed against his umbrella with unrelenting force as he trudged down the street, his dark blue raincoat rustling. It was around 1 a.m., and the full moon was sitting high in the sky above him, almost entirely hidden by the rain clouds that were causing the deluge he was walking through. It was a night when he would usually not go out on his vigilante exploits, and instead look for exorcism work inside buildings. But he didn't have much of a choice in the matter of working in the rain tonight. Nor about what he was doing either. A promise to a spirit was one you kept, unless you were orders of magnitude more powerful than them. And Izuku was dealing with a spirit powerful enough to maintain its own domain. Usually, Izuku wouldn't even consider making a deal with one. But especially this time, he needed to make a deal with her to allow his plan to come to fruition. His thoughts were interrupted as he reached an intersection and paused, tilting the hood of his raincoat up slightly to allow himself to see the traffic lights as he pushed the crossing button on a nearby pole. While he was technically an adult, he and his mother did not have the financial capability to buy him a car, not even for work. Thus, he found himself walking in the rain in the depths of summer, on his way to repay his debt to a spirit. It was an odd life, but he couldn't say that it didn't have its upsides. "I believe you are getting closer to your destination, my student." Izuku just nodded, crossing the street as the small picture of a person on the other side of the road flashed green for him. His gumboots sunk ankle-deep into a pothole in the road, almost tripping him over, but he kept his balance and moved on. Minamoto was right. He was getting closer. The more he walked, the more crowded the street got, full of human ghosts and low-level spirits, mostly those connected to power and violence. He couldn't help the feeling of anger filling him as he continued on, his umbrella shaking slightly in his hand as he neared his destination, a small, dilapidated, one-story building tucked into the corner of a not busy area. All of the lights were on, and he could just barely hear the sound of shouting and laughing and the breaking of glass over the downpour of rain. With his free hand, he checked to make sure that his sword was tucked into his raincoat properly, and that all of his charms were secure in his belt. "I will wait for you across the street. Trust in your blade, Midoriya, and do not hesitate." "Yes, sir." As he arrived outside the building's front door, the awning that stood out from above the doorway allowed him to pack up his umbrella. He leaned it up against an empty chair near the door that still had half a bottle of alcohol tucked under it, making it clear that whoever was supposed to be watching the front door was bludgeoning somewhere. It would make his job easier, however. He reached into the pouch that was stuck to his belt and pulled out a paper charm, placing it against the door and watching the writing on it glow slightly as it stuck to it. Almost immediately, Izuku had to brace himself for the floor of ghosts and spirits that were forcibly removed from the interior of the building. He held his ground, and eventually, the charm did its job, leaving the building empty of everything but the living. He couldn't have any ghosts or spirits getting in his way while inside. With the charm finished its work, Izuku slipped his raincoat off and folded it up nicely, placing it on the empty chair and placing a different charm on top of it, making sure it touched both the umbrella and the raincoat. The small amount of rain that was slipping in underneath the awning was pushed away from his belongings immediately, as the charm created a small bubble around them. Izuku had created this type of charm himself, using his mother's telekinesis as inspiration. The bubbles weren't very strong yet. Unfortunately, not enough to be used to protect himself. But he was working on them every day. They were useful for this, however. Shaking his head, Izuku forced himself to focus on the task at hand. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a plain black cloth mask he had bought at a nearby store, one that would cover his entire face below the nose. He then slipped on a pair of polarized goggles, stopping his eyes from being seen as well. Pulling out a small, prepaid phone that Minamoto had helped him find on the ground in an alleyway, Izuku sent the police a file containing all the information that Miss Kashiwagi had given him on the targets of today's job. He knew that the shortest time it would take the police to get to where he was 7 minutes, so he was on a timer. He practically kicked down the door and was immediately greeted with the sight of a small gang of villains, 4 of them, as well as cages on the other side of the room. Their contents were human, mainly young children. The sound of his entry alerted the villains, all of whom turned to face him, their various mutations and quirks flaring up instinctively as Izuku shut the door behind him. Drawing his sword, Izuku allowed his knees to bend slightly as he adopted a combat stance. "I need your boss, Rizayukai, so he will be coming with me, by force if needed. But please don't feel left out. The police will be here for the rest of you soon enough. Naomasa, what have we got here?" Aizawa's face was stoic as he looked at the building they'd been given a tip about from under Naomasa's umbrella, as well as the gang of human traffickers that they'd apprehended. They looked rather beat up, with only one of the 3 still conscious, which gave some validity to their claims that they'd been attacked. Unfortunately, the actual victims of the human traffickers were clamming up when asked about it, refusing to confirm if there had been an attacker that had helped them. Aizawa had seen it before, especially with vigilante cases, but it was still annoying. An unfortunately common human trafficking case. Kids with potentially powerful quirks were being abducted and shipped off to who knows where for who knows what. I've been on this one for a while, actually. But this tip got us here quicker than we would have otherwise. Aizawa gave Naomasa the stare, and the man wilted slightly, frowning. Yeah, I know. Potential vigilantism and all that. But until the victims actually confirm it, all we have to go off are the claims of the perpetrators, who might think they'll get a lesser sentence if they were caught, because the police used a vigilante. Aizawa sighed. So we've got nothing about the vigilante. Naomasa shook his head, still writing things down on his pad. Unfortunately not. The only proof we even have that they exist is the clear signs of a struggle recently, as well as my quirk letting me know they're telling what they believe to be the truth. But other than that, no DNA, no quirk residue, nothing. Aizawa just shook his head, rubbing at the bridge of his nose. Fine, send me the file you start on them once you've finished questioning them fully. Damn it, why can't these guys just leave it to the pros? And so close to the start of the school year, even. Naomasa nodded, tapping a reminder into his phone, glancing up at the villains, who were now all securely handcuffed and in the squad cars. I'll make sure your info gets to you by tomorrow night. Eraser. I don't think we'll be needing you from here, so go get some sleep. Aizawa just rolled his eyes, shooting out his scarf and pulling himself up the side of a nearby building. "I mean it, Eraser. You clearly need it." He ignored Naomasa's shout from below, rolling to a stop after he flung himself over the edge of the roof and pulling out his hero commission phone to check if any requests had come in. Finding none, he let himself sit up against the edge of the roof for a second, his hero's suit keeping out the worst of the rain and stopping the chill from setting in. Fuck, he's right. With the new school year starting in less than a week, the whole Izuku Midoriya situation, and now this. Pushing himself to his feet, he started running across the rooftops, back to US campus, so that he could, at the very least, grab something to eat. This year is already starting to become far too stressful. Neither Izuku nor Minamoto spoke as they arrived at the edge of Miss Kashiwagi's domain. The unconscious body Izuku carried on his shoulders, and the added weight it brought, did not help slow down his heart as it seemed to try and beat out of his chest. It was almost time. He knew what Miss Kashiwagi wanted this man for. He'd done his own research into who they both were before Miss Kashiwagi died. So he knew that this man was the one responsible for her injuries and eventual death. Izuku knew that Miss Kashiwagi desired revenge. He knew that she likely wanted to watch Izuku kill him for her, but she hadn't actually asked him to do so. Never in her request had she outright stated that she wanted him to kill Riza Yukai, which opened up loopholes, and loopholes would allow for his plan to fruition. Miss Kashiwagi was dangerous. Far too dangerous for a regular human's ghost. When he had been doing his research, he'd found that she had been born with a quirk that can her both telekinesis and a sort of asp, which is likely why she was a more powerful ghost than others. Usually, Izuku would leave well enough alone. The power level of human ghosts meant little in the grand scheme of things, but there was an issue. Miss Kashiwagi wasn't staying within the limits of a human ghost. Her hatred, her desire to kill Rizayukiya, all of it was pushing her already enhanced spirit further and further over the edge, into the territory of an actual evil spirit. And if she was stronger than the average human ghost, then she was likely to be a powerful evil spirit. Izuku couldn't let that happen. So when she manifested fully to take her revenge on Rizayukiya, Izuku would stop her before she could ever reach that point. Nezu hummed as he read the email that Shouta had received from Naomasa. He was privy to almost all of the work-related emails in the building, and the email addresses of the police officers his employees worked closely with were a high priority for him to keep track of. According to the email, a new vigilante was running around the city who had tipped off the police about a human trafficking ring. And while the police and Shouta hadn't seemed to make the connection, it was almost painfully apparent to Nezu that Izuku Midoriya was their man. Not only did the boy live within walking distance from the building, but he also seemed to have come into contact with a spirit that had been on Nezu's radar for a while, who was teetering on the edge of becoming an evil spirit. Going through his own personal security camera network wasn't hard from his office computer, and he scrolled through the list of just barely legal cameras he'd set up around the surrounding city to keep track of certain interests. A slideshow of various dilapidated buildings crossed his screen until he found the one labeled human ghost, not yet domain-level potential evil spirit. Quickly scanning through the recorded video, he got to the previous night and started slowing down how fast he skimmed through, going in bursts until he spotted him. Dressed in all black, with a sword strapped to his back, was a person who matched Izuku Midoriya's build. They had a body on their shoulders and seemed to be talking to the ghost of a samurai, the same one that had been with him during the entrance exam. A contemplative look appeared on Nezu's face as he saw the boy and the samurai part, with Izuku taking the body into the ghost's domain. A quick skim of the email Naomasa sent Shouter revealed that the one who was kidnapped, or at least, the one the traffickers claimed got kidnapped, was one Riza Yukai, a wanted criminal and villain known for injuring and impairing an ex-pro hero's movements enough that some falling debris killed her, alongside some of his own. personal research into Izuku Midoriya. He had an excellent idea of what the boy might be attempting to do. Multiple clips of someone who matched how Izuku was dressed tonight covered his second monitor. Each showed him exercising spirits around Japan, and Nezu couldn't help but grin. Without anyone else's intervention, the spirit that inhabited the building Izuku had just entered, whom Nezu assumed was the ghost of one Yukabu Kashiwagi, would likely have manifested as a true, high-tier evil spirit, requiring Nezu to call some of his more mystical contacts to clear it out. But this was an excellent opportunity to see what level Izuku was truly on when it came to the mystic arts. Nezu had only spotted him exercising lower to medium-tier evil spirits, but the ability to even make physical contact with a spirit, a notoriously difficult technique, was something he did effortlessly, passively even. Nezu would admit that the idea of recruiting him was a very favorable one, but he wouldn't rush through the process just based on the standard heroics entrance exam. The spiritual world was a different beast altogether, and thus required a different benchmark. As truly tragic as her story was, Yukabu Kashiwagi would provide an excellent test. "It's time to show me what you are capable of, young man." He couldn't help the shudder that shot down his spine as he crossed the threshold of Miss Kashiwagi's lair. If he had thought that the atmosphere in her lair had been heavy before, then right now, it was almost crushing him. He strode forward down the path and entered the doorway of the decrepit building. "Ha ha ha, back already. My, what a good little helper you are. If you didn't have Spirit's Bane practically drenching your entire outfit, I might have even hugged you for how happy I am." Izuku couldn't help the slight wince at the mention of the Spirit's Bane he had infused into his clothing. A not-so-subtle reminder from the ghost that she could sense the mixed concoction of anti-spiritual materials embedded into his outfit. Still, he faked complete innocence, kneeling in front of the chair Miss Kashiwagi had become accustomed to sitting in. She was clearly an arrogant woman having her own throne, even in the afterlife. But it could also be that her hatred had corrupted her personality once she became a ghost, making her this arrogant. Riza Yukai's unconscious body was placed down on the ground as gently as he could. He then stood back up again, stepping away from the body, and kneeling again. As he did, he felt the pressure he had been feeling on his soul since he made the deal with her loosen. He had fulfilled his part of the arrangement. Wonderful, you've got him. And he's unconscious, so fragile and helpless. He kept his face as calm as he could, but he felt a little disappointed in himself. How had he ever even considered making a deal with this horrible spirit? Ah, right, desperation for information about the UA entrance exam. One of the most important tests he would ever have to take. He subtly pinched himself in the leg, refocusing on reality. It was easier to get distracted when in a spirit's domain, their very essence and emotions permeating the whole area, putting mortal minds on the defensive. He stayed silent as Miss Kashiwagi floated around Riza Yukai's unconscious form for a minute or two, yelling obscenities he would never repeat and curses that he wouldn't wish on his worst enemies at the man. But she hadn't manifested yet. And so Izuku stayed kneeling, waiting for Miss Kashiwagi to address him. Which didn't take too long, her taunting seemingly boring her after a little while. "It's less fun if I can't touch him, Midoriya. You can kill him now. Then when he becomes a ghost, I'll be able to rip him apart with my bare hands." Izuku took a deep breath, suddenly feeling the weight of the sword on his back, even heavier than usual, as he prepared to wield it. After calming his nerves, he rose to his feet and looked at Miss Kashiwagi dead on. No. She had balked when he had looked at her, the show of disrespect a clear one. But as he spoke, he felt her aura grow sharper around him, the very domain he was standing in turning aggressive to his presence. "Excuse me." The sheer rage in her voice was palpable, but Izuku held his ground as the waves of negative energy threatened to throw him back, tucking a hand into his jacket, grabbing one of his charms and pushing his energy into it. a protective warmth surrounding him like a shield. It sounded goofy, but sometimes having a charm full to the brim, with the contained energy of his mother's love for him, was one of the best defenses he could ask for. Not that it would hold up to an actual attack, but it was great to combat a passive aura like this. His resistance to her attempt to intimidate him just made her even angrier, her form warping even more than it had been, and Izuku could tell that she was on the cusp of becoming a proper evil spirit. Actually, with how quickly she was changing, it was more correct to say that she had been straddling the line between a ghost and an evil spirit for a long time. A part of him felt guilty for speeding it along with his plan, but he steeled himself. This was going to have happened anyway. At least he would be here to fight here at her weakest. You dare say no to me? A deal was struck. Kill him, or have your betrayal tear your soul to shreds. Izuku drew his sword, reaching into his jacket with his other hand, pulling out a small vial of purple oil and letting it drip down onto the blade, the sweet scent of the wisteria oil filling his nostrils. I don't think so. The deal was that I bring him here. You made no mention of what I would be doing after that. I am free to act as I want. Miss Kashiwagi stuttered at that. And even though she didn't have a head, Izuku could feel the shocked anger blazing from her soul. So he didn't need to see her face to know he had just royally pissed her off. You little fucking brat. He's a criminal. A villain. He's just scum. Not worth saving. So why do you not put him down like the dog he is? Izuku sighed, adopting a combat stance, his sword pointed at Miss Kashiwagi. Because this man belongs wholly to the world of the living, and it will be the living who pass judgment on him. I am not an executioner for hire. The flood of negative emotions that escaped Miss Kashiwagi as his words sunk in was torrential. But he kept his eyes on her as best he could, trusting the protection charm to work its magic. It was during this flood that he felt the shift in the domain around him, and in the spiritual core of Miss Kashiwagi herself. Darker, more malevolent, lacking the tinge of humanity that kept ghosts anchored to their previous lives. Miss Kashiwagi had ascended to the rank of evil spirit, and if his senses were correct, a very powerful one, for a newly formed evil spirit. In all honesty, he had fought stronger spirits before, but not alone like he was now. This would take all the tricks he had in his arsenal, but he could do it. He knew he could, and so did Minamoto. So as Kashiwagi let out her first attack, her telekinesis picking up almost every object not nailed down in her domain, Izuku pushed forward, the oil on his sword shimmering in the shifting light. Yukabu Kashiwagi was truly powerful. She felt powerful, for the first time in over a decade. Finally, she had the power to get her revenge on the bastard that had caused her death. If only this brat would get out of the way. Her telekinesis allowed her to move non-living objects, and the imprint of her quirk had seemingly attached to her spiritual energy because it was easier than ever before to throw things at Midoriya. Annoyingly, frustratingly, however, the brat always seemed to weave out of the way. And to make it worse, he kept throwing things around the room that smelled like rotten meat. She had forgotten what it was like to smell things. Leave the bastard to me, then, if you won't kill him. Die, and watch as I finally get my revenge. A wave of her hand was that her hand. It looked so different, sent a barrage of debris hurtling towards Midoriya, and she thought that she hit him as a plume of smoke exploded out from where he was running, but was proven wrong when he jumped out of the smoke towards her, his sword arm wound back. Shing. As pain shot through her entire body, she screamed. It burned, it burned, it burned, it burned. What the fuck was on his sword? I'll kill you for that, you ungrateful, disloyal little shit. As the arm that he had just chopped off of her hit the ground and dissolved, he darted away again before she was able to grab him with her other arm. You seem to already be trying that. How is it going? As his words clicked, her vision went red. a scream of rage escaping her as she started wildly throwing objects at him as fast as she could, not giving him any chance to rest. Her energy felt endless, but he was only human. As long as she could wear him down, then this annoying little fly would be gone from her home. Just a little longer. Okay? She was angry. It was giving her a new level of power. Despite how it seemed, getting her this angry was his plan. An evil spirit's power grows alongside their emotions. So with the power high that she was riding right now due to inhuman levels of rage and hatred, it also had the side effect of making her entirely focused on him, meaning that Izuku didn't have to use time and resources to protect Riza Yukai. He slid under a burst of debris she sent at his head, slapping a charm on the ground underneath him that instantly halted his movement, and he rolled backwards, dodging the follow-up she sent towards where his legs would have been. As it crashed into the wall, he reached into his jacket, pulling out a packet of richly colored brown powder. Cacao powder, mainly used to smother the emotions of spirits and ghosts alike. It wouldn't be enough to completely neuter a spirit, especially not one as powerful as Kashiwagi, but it would cause a significant, and more importantly sudden dip in power. Vibrations shot through his arm as he batted away a couple of steel pipes with his sword, the metal not even bending to the impact as he scanned the room. It seemed that she was running out of debris on her side of the room, her constant barrage slowing down. This is my chance. Clenching his fist around the bag of cacao powder, he felt a small click, followed by the sound of a fuse burning. Now on a timer, he darted forward, flipping over a table she threw at him and kicking off it towards her. His arm wrenched back, before pelting the cacao powder bag at her. The fuse of the fairly large firecracker he'd placed inside of it perfectly timed with it striking her in the chest. And Izuku was suddenly very glad for his goggles and mask as brown power exploded from the bag with a loud bang. Immediately, he could feel the sharp sensation of her domain dull quite a bit, and he knew that the cacao powder was suppressing her emotions and thus limiting her power. Pushing forward, he put both hands on his sword. What the hell is this? Her question echoed through the domain, but Izuku wasn't in a very educational mood. He dived into the cloud of brown powder that hung around the spirit, drawn in by her energy, and with both hands, swung his sword with all his might. He felt a small amount of resistance before he heard a crack, and he sailed right on through her. He hit the ground hard, having fully committed to the last attack, and was forced to stab his sword into the ground to slow him so he didn't hit the wall back first and wind himself. With a flash of sleight of hand, Izuku whipped a charm out of his jacket, throwing it towards the cloud of powder and activating it, sending out a small blast of wind in every direction, dispersing the cacao powder. His sword was still raised, and he was ready to continue fighting. However, it looked like he was done for the night. As both halves of Miss Kashiwagi's distorted form lay on the ground, her spiritual core split right down the middle. She started dissolving from both ends. Izuku sighed as he lowered his sword, walking towards her. I am truly sorry, Miss Kashiwagi. He knew that she couldn't hear him, but it felt good to apologize anyway. He hadn't wanted to exercise her. If he had the chance, he would have tried his best to pull her away from the spiral of hatred she had been going down, but she was already past the point of no return when he met her. Instead of letting her slowly dissolve, something that he had been told was rather painful for an evil spirit, he slashed his sword over the remains of her spiritual core, shattering it completely. She vanished instantly, the slightly glowing dust like energy dissipating. He almost buckled at the knee as he felt her domain instantly start to shrink as well, and immediately sprinted for the exit, grabbing Rizu Yukai on his way out. He made it out of the shrinking domain and dumped the still unconscious man onto the floor, turning back and watching as the domain got smaller and smaller, before eventually blipping out of existence entirely. You are alive and well. That is excellent to see. Congratulations on your success. I can no longer sense any of Lady Kashiwagi's spiritual energy. Even with the clear joy in Minamoto's tone, Izuku could only give him a sharp nod, not in as good a mood as the ghostly samurai seemed to be. Let's just drop this guy off with the police. I want to go to bed 5 minutes ago. A soft laugh escaped Minamoto as he placed a hand on Izuku's shoulder. I know this was hard for you, Midoriya, but take solace in knowing you saved a great many lives today. No matter the results of this school test of yours, know that I see you as a true hero already. Izuku felt his throat closing up as he held back a sob, but the hand on his shoulder moved to ruffle his hair. Do not hold back your tears, young man. Allow yourself to feel your emotions completely. A warrior who has no regret whatsoever about having to end another's existence is no better than an animal, and you are the furthest from an animal I have met in a long time. Izuku fell to his knees outside of the building, Minamoto leaving his hand on his head, and cried softly, all the while completely unaware of the camera across the street, the test he had just passed, and the interest he had garnered.